Well, hey everybody, welcome to this edition of Approaching the Scene. I'm Hudson Henry. Got a really cool video planned for today. I'm going to go over a few of your questions, and then I'm going to go through and show sort of my two-stage process for processing photos in Lightroom and on One Photo Raw. And I'm going to actually hop from one of your questions into that because it kind of drove this thought process in my mind, and you'll see what I mean. I just got back from an amazing workshop on the Oregon coast with it was a full workshop with 10 just amazing people, and I want to thank each and every one of you for making that workshop so fantastic. I know as I'm jumping back into work here in the studio, my heart's still kind of out on the coast with all of you. So thanks again for having such a wonderful attitude and everybody to be in such an engaged learning mode out there. We had a wonderful time. So the first question I'm going to take comes from Bodon, who says, I'm wondering how different this course is from Approaching the Scene that you did for OM1. It was a course I did for OM1. Have you updated that course? Anyway, I absolutely love your videos and have watched them over and over. I'll always seem to pick up something new. Thanks so much, Bogdan. That means the world to me that you're really getting something from the videos. This is not so much an update to that course I did for OM1. It's a whole new video series that is just going to be a weekly series focused on all things photographic and visual imaging, as well as taking questions from everyone. And I am doing a whole bunch of new courses. And you will see those coming soon. There's a lot of content coming out from late this summer through the end of the year, so just keep your eye peeled and stay on my email list, and you'll be seeing it coming. CJ asks, I've been following your fluid head videos, and my question is this: have you tried a mini fluid head for monopods? So it's interesting. I think monopods are really specifically sort of for one thing, and to me, a fluid head on a monopod would sort of defeat what's so wonderful about the fluid head. To me, the fluid head, you set up your tripod, you just loosen this bowl adapter, whether you have one between, your current sort of tripod with a center column and a plate mount, or whether you have one of these bowl tripods like I prefer, where you can just level it from below. Once you get that head level, while you're in position photographing a scene, whatever you do with the camera for composition and readjustment, it all stays level. The other thing that's phenomenal about it is being able to do really smooth movements for video. Now that we can do video, we can do it both vertically, horizontally, both at the same time. If I had a fluid head on a monopod, all that stability and level would sort of be dependent upon how I'm rotating the monopod. And I know that Manfrotto has some with a tiny little tripod down kind of at the bottom that they sell. To me, that's not a very stable system. The minute that the wind comes up, there's going to be a problem. I want a nice, stable tripod for that kind of work. And I don't have a monopod, so I'm just demonstrating with a floor broom, kind of a funny thing. But to me, where a monopod shines is in sports photography. You're crowded with other photographers in the end zone. There's not that much room to move around, or you're, in a soccer stadium at the World Cup and you've got a big, long 400mm lens. You can't really be running around with a big tripod. You just have that thing mounted right on the lens, and usually they just have kind of a up and down head, and you can kind of get the level that you want and just tilt around, and you get some stability. You get a little bit of ability to shoot at a slightly slower shutter speed, and just the ability to frame up and stay still, but move position really quickly and plant it. There's no level that's gained with a monopod. I don't own one because sports is not my main focus. It could be handy for wildlife, but I tend to just keep my tripod collapsed if I'm doing that kind of thing with wildlife. So for me, a nice, sturdy, reliable tripod is a key ingredient to getting good photos, and I won't sacrifice stability for weight and price. And I think that, there's a great article written years ago by Tom Hogan about the fact that everyone tends to waste $1,000 on their way to a good tripod. They'll all buy 5 tripods before they get to the one that actually works properly for the kind of photography that they do. And that it's sometimes best to just skip ahead and get that one that works for you, that you're satisfied with, and that you're not cursing all the time because it's not holding your camera steady, or it's difficult to get positioned, or it's hard to be level. And for me, this kit is relatively affordable as compared to a high-end ball head kit, and works really, really well. It never makes me frustrated in the field. So, on a related note, Jane asked, where do I find the equipment link? She said she really liked last week's video on the fluid heads. Thanks so much. So, the fluid head links were linked. If you're watching the video, there's places to click. If you go into the YouTube page, there's if you look at the description that's on that page, there's a link to my website with links, and there's also a link on my blog. If you go to hudsonhenry.com, go to the blog. In the last couple of weeks, there's a link to that video on fluid heads, and in that is a link into that page of links. So shouldn't be too hard. If you have any trouble finding it, just shoot me a message, and I'll make sure that you get right to it. So there's another question here from Brad, a really simple one. Is there any openings still for your Mount Rainier workshop? There are. I'm going to put a link right here. You can also just jump over to my website. Here's my website. If you go to photo training, you'll see there's a link right up near the top for Mount Rainier. There's only a few spots left. I'd hurry up. There's also a link in there to workshops, courses, editing tools. All that stuff's available right there. And like I said, if you go to the blog for those links that we were talking about, right here are the links. Really simple on the blog on my website. So hopefully that helps out. So then the final question that I've got here is, early this week, it's from Christopher. I photographed a scene of the Sierra Mountains, and it was a clear day with a few clouds. I did bracket the exposure to make sure I had good images to work with. What I noticed after I downloaded the images is that they have a blue cast from the haze. How do I remove the haze and make the mountain stand out? And I went ahead, you submitted that image to me, you emailed it to me, and I went ahead and loaded it. I've got it right here in Lightroom, and I'm gonna process it a little bit. It doesn't look so much to me as if there's a haze, as if this was just shot in the middle of the day in kind of blue sky light, and there's not a ton of contrast. It's that kind of top, middle of the day light that's a little trickier to work with in the landscape. There's either really high contrast shadows, or at this kind of hour, where it's a little bit high noon, there's not so much shadows as it's just kind of all lit the same. It's a bit harsh and it's all lit a bit the same. So I'm going to go in and just kind of talk about this two-stage process that I have. I have sort of a philosophy on photo editing that you raw process your image and sort of save that raw processed version, let's call it a version or a virtual copy in Lightroom, and then you can duplicate that. You're working on the raw file, and you can spin out versions to finish edit, to stylize, to finish another way. But there's kind of a correct way to raw process the tone and color, and maybe in some images, noise reduction and sharpening of an individual image before it's going to go get finish edited for a specific purpose, whether it's for a digital output or for a print. And so I'm just going to go through Lightroom's basic develop panel here and show you my process and how I would pull some tones and do some color adjustments out of this image. When we look at the histogram here at the top, you can see that there's quite a bit of the histogram with no data, both in the shadows and the highlights. And we can get a lot more contrast out of the image. When you see everything kind of bunched up in the middle, there's more contrast to be had from this image if we spread that data across the histogram. And this is exactly the same process whether you're using any of the big raw processors out there, whether you're using Capture One, On1 Photo Raw, Lightroom, you name it. It's the same essential process. And I know that a lot of people preach, start in the order that the sliders are set up in the software. I tend to be a person who kind of harkens back to my old Photoshop roots, and I'll hold down I like to highlight in Lightroom. I like to highlight these little triangles that show the clipping mask for highlights and the clipping mask for shadows. I like to close down this left panel and develop so I have a bigger image to work with. I like to pull this right panel here. There's this point where you hit it with your mouse and it becomes somewhere in here. It looks like I'm making a liar of me, but you can generally kind of pull this panel left and right. Yeah, there it is. If you get a hold of it, you can get your sliders a little bit wider. And I like to have them a little wider so there's a little more fine-tuned adjustment in the sliders. And I'm going to start with whites and blacks. And if I grab this slider and start moving it, you'll see that at a certain point, the whites start to clip. You can see it in the clouds and in the snow on the mountain. I want to just move it back to where I'm not clipping any of those white tones, right there. I'm going to do the same thing with blacks. I'm going to pull it to the left till I start seeing the shadows turn blue. And you can see that in the grasses down here in the foreground. And honestly, when I'm photo editing, I care a little bit less about clipping some shadows than I do about highlights. And that's because I love to print, and when you print an image that has pure white, it doesn't put any ink down, and you get this gloss differential on the paper that looks terrible. I don't like to have pure white if I can avoid it when I'm editing an image, but I don't mind a little bit of pure black because that's just black ink and that'll look good in a print or on the screen. So, I don't want too much of it, but I'm fine with having a bit of pure black just to lift contrast a bit. The next thing I'm going to do is just mess with the highlights and shadows. And sometimes I just make big dramatic movements. Here I'm moving the shadow slider up. It's doing very little to the image. There's just not that much shadow in this image. It's mostly highlights. It's because it's in the middle of the day. So I'm just going to kind of leave that. It's not going to do a whole lot for me. I'm guessing I'm going to pull highlights down, but I can move that slider around. Actually, by moving them up a little bit, I seem to get just a touch more contrast. And since we're talking about contrast, I'm going to go ahead and move the contrast slider around. And as you see me doing that, you'll see the image just getting more and more interesting looking. So, a little bit more contrast does a lot for this image. And you're talking about a blue tone. Well, I don't know if you've ever photographed the interior of a house during daylight with an open window and you see sunlight coming through, mixing with that warm interior lighting of your house, and it looks blue in the shadows. Our eyes kind of blend all the different colors of light so that they look the same to us. It's our brain processing a lot, but the camera doesn't do that. And the truth is that middle of the day daylight is a relatively blue part of the light spectrum. So you've got that kind of middle of the day blue light playing on the mountains. And we can balance that a little bit just by warming the scene up with the temperature slider here. In any of the raw processing software that we use, these sliders are going to be almost the same. I'm just going to go in here and warm up the whole scene a little bit to kind of get rid of that blue cast in the mountains. Down here, I usually add just a little bit of clarity to my images. Not a lot, but just a little bit. That's kind of a local contrast and sharpness that just makes things pop a little bit. It isn't doing a whole lot. I don't want to do a lot at this stage. I'd rather do more of that in the finishing edit, but a little bit. I usually add somewhere 6 to 10 clarity. And then dehaze is going to get rid of there's not a lot of haze in this scene, but it's going to get rid of a little bit of that haze. And a lot of times when I'm using dehaze, I worry about it potentially kind of mucking with the scene. It can make noise worse in a noisy image, or it can kind of bring artifacts out if there's a problem. So, I'm gonna be a little gentle with dehaze, and I like to zoom in and watch what's happening as I pull the dehaze slider. It's definitely added taken a little bit of that distance haze out of the mountain and kind of made it a little more contrasty, a little sharper. And I think that's pretty good. That's basically the raw processed image as far as I'm concerned. The only other thing I would consider doing is jumping here into the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. And if you're a Lightroom user, you might open that and see just the hue, just the saturation, or just the luminance panel. I like to activate all of them so that I just have them all sitting here. And I like to use the targeted adjustment tool. So if I was to mess with the sky, when I drag hue, it's going to make the sky a little dark, more royal blue, or a little more aqua as I drag that. It's really changing the hue of that color that I'm hovering over. And all I'm doing is clicking and dragging that slider a little bit. And I'm just going to make it a little less aqua, a little more royal blue, very small, just +3 there. Then I'm going to grab the targeted adjustment tool for saturation, and I'm actually going to desaturate it a little bit. The blues seem a little more saturated than the rest of the image to me, and I'm worried that when I finish edit, it's going to enhance that even more. I kind of want to balance with how saturated the whole image is, from the yellows to the blues. And then with luminance, I can go up here over the blues and maybe make them just a little bit darker. I'm just clicking and dragging down over the color that I want to alter. If I did it on the yellows, it would make the yellows brighter or the yellows darker. And I'm just going to hit the Control Z or Command Z for us on Apples to just undo that last move that I did. So what I really want to do is just make the sky just a smidge darker. And as I'm doing all this, I see there's quite a bit of sensor dust in your image. And we can get rid of that using this it's the healing brush. And one thing that's nice in here is you can visualize spots. You hit this button and it just makes them stand out. And I'm not going to go ahead and zap every single one of them, but let's get the biggest ones. I'm just going to hover over them. My cursor's sized about right. I'm clicking. And just so everyone knows, that yellow ring around my brush is some presentation software that just makes it easier for you to follow where my brush is. That has nothing to do with Lightroom. So I'm just zapping the biggest sensor dust spots. I think it's definitely time for you to blow out your sensor. And if you're someplace where you have an opportunity to get it cleaned, it's probably a good idea. I actually have a sensor dust cleaning training course. If I jump up here, I'll show you back here on my website. If you go into the photo training page and have a look at the courses, there's a sensor dust cleaning short course, and it kind of covers both dry and wet cleaning. So I'm just going through, I'm zapping those bits of sensor dust. If you clean the sensor in your camera, you'll do a lot less of this in post-production. And then I'll just turn that off, and you see we got rid of most of it there. So at this point, I would consider this image raw processed. All that I would do with it to totally finish it is I like to finish edit in on-one effects. Sometimes I raw process in on-one's photo raw as well. Before I finish edit this though, I would go in and I would create a version. The shortcut key for it is Command or Control apostrophe. And I want to save this original version that's just raw processed. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish edit this one in on-one effects. So I want to create a Photoshop document. This is going to create a new file that's not a raw file. If I'm using On1 Photo Raw 2018 as a plugin to Lightroom, it's going to jump into Photo Raw with a Photoshop document, and I'm choosing the parameters of that. I want a Photoshop document. I want it to be in ProPhoto RGB. That's the widest color space I can be editing in to protect me from accidentally clipping colors in the editing process that I can't see on my screen. Another whole discussion there. Just remember, that's a good thing to be editing a raw file or a PSD in, or not a raw file, but a PSD or a TIFF file in. I want it to be in 16-bit color depth for the same reason, just to protect from accidental clipping during the editing process. And I'm going to go ahead and click Edit. And that's going to create a new Photoshop document, and it's going to ask me if I want to open it as a normal or a smart photo in Photo Raw. I tend to open it as a normal photo. If you open it as a smart photo, it'll save every editing move. But when you're doing that with a PSD file, it tends to make a really large file. So I tend to just use a normal file, and I'm kind of careful with it. And I'm not going to go through and edit this from scratch in Photo Raw because this video is already getting a little long, but I'm just going to choose one of my presets here from the left panel. And I'm going to go ahead, this is a summery looking photo, I'm going to choose a summer preset, and I can use this quick view browser to kind of look at what these presets would look writ large on my scene. And I see I've got Summer Mountain. It makes the sky a little bit blue. It's a little oversaturated, but I like what it's doing from a contrast perspective. And so what I'm going to do is just adjust that. Anytime I use a preset, whether it's in Lightroom, whether it's in On1, I like to think of it as a starting point and not an ending point. You know, even with my own presets, I just think it's a shortcut to getting close to what you want, and then you have to tweak it a little bit. And as I scroll down this list of the filters that were applied here, I see, you know, there's a tone enhancer, there's an HDR look filter that might be a little more than what I want. It's not doing a whole lot though. It's just a slight amount of compression there. You know, if I turn it on and off, it's not having a major effect on the image. Dynamic contrast is what's really bringing out a lot of the look in this image. And the color enhancer, that's where that slightly oversaturated look might be coming from. There it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn the opacity of that down. I can blend in a little bit of it without all of it. So I think that looks a lot better, just like that. And then I want to just have a quick look at what this vignette is doing on the image, because that's going to need to be individually adjusted to each image. And I can adjust its roundness. I can make it a little bit rounder, and I can make it a little bit smaller, and I can drag it so that it's right over the kind of most important part of my scene, this mountaintop, and then turn that feather back up so that it's blended in again. and I can adjust its brightness, you know, whether I want it to be very dark or just slightly dark. There's very few images that I edit that I don't apply a little bit of vignetting to at the end to just guide the eye to what's important in the scene. It's really subtle, but watch what happens when I turn it off. It just brings your eye right in. And if I look at what this image looked like, finish edited or raw processed in Lightroom versus what we just did in On1, it's subtle, but it really makes it pop. So that would be the end of my process. I hit done. It's going to go ahead and save out all those edits, round trip it back into Lightroom and stack it on top of those the raw processed file in Lightroom. And you haven't done anything that affects that raw file. You've created a new PSD file just to finish edit. And if I was going to do a different style, say a black and white, I would just take the raw processed file back into Photo Raw and edit it as a black and white. That's my process. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, Christopher. I don't think it's so much of a haze or a blue cast as it's just a little bit flat light, and it just needs a little bit of raw processing for tone and for color to pull it out and before you finish edit it. So hope everybody enjoyed. Hit me up with questions. You can always submit questions and I will be looking at them every week. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.